No, I haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet.
It's not complete, and some of the some of the phrasing might, I might go back and edit that, but that's essentially an explanation of why the Aristotelian approach to libertarianism is superior so far. Now, the part that I'm at is explaining why it makes sense to consider libertarianism to historically be to historically be a leftist doctrine if looking at the like the pre-Marxian dichotomy, where it's not a political concept, but it's the dichotomy between modernity and tradition and radicalism.
All right. And by the way, the stream has started, and I just posted a link in the back alley. We don't have any viewers at the moment, but I imagine it's going to change in not too distant future.
Oh, it started? All right. Well, hey, everybody. How are you guys doing? Yeah, I kind of wasn't expecting the stream to start. So I was planning on shilling out the link to the stream in the meantime. But I guess while we're waiting for people to show up, do you want to talk about anything particularly?
Yeah. Before we get into the main thing we wanted to talk about, what we wanted to make the stream about, what we wanted to do was go into what was it? What we were going to talk about the week before, or on Friday's stream, which unfortunately we could not do.
We were going to talk about Friday's stream. That stream didn't happen for complications. I guess we'll leave it at that. We could elaborate, but
yeah, let's not. But anyways, we can still discuss it, or at least touch upon it. So what happened is that I don't remember if it was Thursday or Friday specifically, but Donald Trump went to the National Archives to do a speech announcing his executive order, read Imperial Decree, to create something called the 1776 Commission. Now, what the 1776 Commission is a bunch of people who are going to be designing a national curriculum that Trump says is going to be more patriotic, more pro-American, more nationalist. This is meant to be a counter to the 1619 Project, and although I am paraphrasing, Trump did call it the 1619 Project by name. So this isn't just my speculation. This is something that he actually says. And I'm pretty sure you all are at least passingly familiar with the 1619 Project, but for those of you who aren't aware, its origins lie in an editorial put forward in the New York Times about how the founding of the United States should not be considered to be 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was written, or 1781 when the Constitution was ratified, but rather, 1787 was when the Constitution was ratified, my mistake, or 1781 when the Revolutionary War ended and Britain officially recognized the United States as a sovereign entity. So what's so special about 1619 that year specifically is that is the first time in American colonial history where slavery was recognized as legitimate under colonial law. Fun fact, the first slave was actually himself owned by a black man. So this whole racist narrative that they're trying to put forward and is the impetus of the 1619 Project doesn't really make any sense because the first slave owner was himself black. And this whole thing is supposed to be about how American history is characterized by whiteness, and whiteness is itself oppressive, racist, imperialist, all sorts of nasty pejoratives that they really want to try to thrust upon people. This, of course, I mean, I know why they're doing this. Because if you can make an entire population feel guilty about something that they can't control, then you can effectively exploit them for infinite resources. It's effectively a form of emotional manipulation as extortion. And, well, it's absolutely horrendous, absolutely monstrous what they're trying to do.
That is definitely a reason why they chose this sort of Afrocentrist critical theory type racial propaganda as the avenue for the specific narrative that they are pushing for history in the government schools. But what the 1776 doctrine shows us is that the 1619 doctrine was part of a broader plan to try and create sort of itself a macro Hegelian dialectic where the government could promote essentially state propaganda but marketed towards the opposing side, so to speak, of the political dichotomy that they've constructed. And half of the population are going to be completely they're going to lose all skepticism towards that because it conforms to their political understanding, to their political leanings. I mean, not understanding, but essentially, this is just part of a broader trend that I've noticed and have been attempting to draw attention to, of the increasing politicization of reality itself. And the reason, for those of you who don't know, why the state has such a strong interest in politicizing as many aspects of life as possible is because when something, so how the state manipulates you into perceiving its necessity or perceiving it as having a significant influence over your life directly and being a means towards your safety, security, and having your interests met is by convincing you that not convincing you. It's something that they start doing from the very start of primary school education. This is what the Prussian model is designed to do, but it's designed to sort of embody this sense that the policies created by the state are the root of everything. How much wealth you have, the associations that you have with other people, they all stem from legislative decrees made by the state, and therefore the stem of not just your interests, but your identity and continuing to exist is largely dependent on these legislative decrees. Now, obviously, that's nonsense for reasons that we've elaborated on in the past. But yeah, it's become, now that we're living in sort of the later stages of late statism, and this is something that has been documented in past failed states. The Soviet Union, for instance, where it was described as like feeling like you're insane because of state propaganda. Well, that's the one thing first and foremost that state propaganda does, is it seeks to instill this notion that more and more things are political. And that's sort of in a desperate attempt to try and stop you from going to these avenues, these counter-economic avenues, and actually, taking your life back into your own hands and associating with other people to have your interests met in markets they can't control. But that's sort of what we're seeing here, is that, but being applied to the curriculums that they use in education. Now you can't even get to the root of the problem, the Prussian model of education. Instead, it's either liberals trying to push the 1619 doctrine or Republitards pushing the 1776 doctrine, which I'm sure is going to be full of jingoistic bullshit once it's actually put out. That's even worse than the sort of Afrocentrist dogma you see now, just sort of, for other subjects.
It goes without saying that the 1619 project is a real thing, and it is a thing that people do actually deal with. It's been in place, as far as I know, in 2,300 classrooms across the United States. Note I said classrooms and not schools. There's a difference. But it does indicate that there are a lot of people who are being taught not only this ridiculous and absurd view of American history, but also this part of this 1619 project that is far larger than just reframing America's history as though we're somehow motivated entirely by malice against brown people. Part of the 1619 project includes that it was Africans who actually discovered America first. What's their evidence for this? None. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and all the great Greek philosophers? Yeah, they were all black. They were all African immigrants.
Aristotle was a black man.
Yeah. And the ancient China was originally founded by black people. Basically, anytime anything great happened in history was exclusively done as a result of Africans bringing their hyper technological advancement in enlightened, trans-sapient, mega-brained super intelligence with them. Now, how is it possible that Wakanda was overtaken by a bunch of white people with muskets? Because imperialism, I guess.
Yeah, the "we was Kangs" meme. I'm sure everybody watching or in passing has probably at least heard of it. Well, it's based on an aspect of Afrocentrism, specifically because Afrocentrists claim that pharaohs in Egypt were black people, which is just simply wrong. As in the bodies of a lot of these royal families are mummified, and we were able to extract genetic information from them enough to prove definitively they're not black.
But they still want to try to push forward this narrative I can't even begin to speculate on the reasons why. Probably to make them. I don't know if it's just something to make themselves feel better, or make them feel like everything that's bad that's happened to them has been a result of being victimized by some perceived or actual aggressor, and as such, they can demand resources as part of their call for reparations that I'm sure you've heard about.
That's what it is. It's your brain on identitarianism. Instead of actually, just going out and accomplishing things individually and actually, claiming them as your accomplishments, or actually being able to have a coherent historical narrative, your mere identity gets tied to these narratives, because from the political perspective, you become fearful that these narratives will influence policy. So you get you get people twisting themselves into these insane mental pretzels, and trying to put forward things like this in order from their perspective to justify their existence. When in reality, you don't need to justify your existence. You just need to get that brain worm that's politics out of your head.
Mm-hmm. And just to look at the comments for a second, Albedo said, in reply to a comment you said earlier about how everything is being politicized, he says, just like the sovereign individual predicted, the Catholic Church did the same thing, making everything about religion shortly before the end of the medieval era. And yes, I believe that's an absolutely accurate observation.
I use the Soviet Union as sort of a pressing example because that was only 30 years ago now. But yeah, if you look at pretty much any major political body or state entity throughout history that has collapsed because it has become unable to sustain itself, you will see, within the last decade or couple decades of its existence, it increasingly tries to convince people that their existence is dependent upon some sort of political narrative that they very easily they essentially have control over. So it's that's sort of something that you have to look out for, that a lot of people aren't particularly conscious to. Something that a lot of people don't even recognize. So I mean, if you hear in conventional conversation, these the concept of politics and social organization are so closely intertwined with one another that they're often used as synonyms in just passing conversation. And obviously that's nonsense. If on a local scale, what was the political thing that motivated you to want to go to McDonald's instead of going to Taco Bell?
Mm-hmm. Now, back to the topic of the 1619 project. I see people bringing this up in the comments a bit, and I think it's a good idea. I think a good thing to address. One thing that rarely gets talked about or even brushed over in even the current non 1619 project thing about the transatlantic slave trade is that the Europeans and the white Americans were not enslaving black people. They were buying them from black slave traders who had already enslaved them and then bringing them over to the United States, or rather the American colony. So that's something that's going to get brushed over, I can guarantee you, in the 1619 project. But I think, touching on what you were saying earlier about this being a Hegelian dialectic model, I mean, I saw this actually earlier today when there was some conservative I know IRL. I talked to them about the 1619 project and how it's going to be 1619 project and the 1776 project, and their response to the 1776 commission was good. I mean, this is not me saying this, I'm just paraphrasing what they said. I'm glad that Donald Trump is doing something to push back against the 1619 project, because the 1619 project is bad. But then I reminded them that, like, hold on a second. Didn't you agree with me before that the United States government should have no involvement in education? Oh, right. Yes. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It creates a Hegelian dialectic model where you have a thesis, 1619 project, antithesis, the 1776 commission, both of which are absolutely ridiculous and hyperbolic distortions of history, just pure historical negationism, designed to make people conform to one government-centric point of view. And that's where the synthesis comes in, where whichever one you side with, or whichever one ends up winning in the end, one will modify the other, but fundamentally, the extent to which the government is in total control over society is largely going to remain embedded inside of these historical narratives. Nothing really changes. All that's really done is you're forced into one of two government-approved opinions.
That's I guess a simpler way of trying to put it. But yeah, the true actual libertarian position, the negation of the 1619 project, is not to accept the 1619 project, but being told from a different approved opinion. It is to essentially negate the government education system itself.
Mm-hmm. And that's what's just going to keep happening. I mean, I think it was not even 10, 20 years ago when conservatives were talking about getting government out of education entirely. Now they've kind of just forgotten about it and they're just trying to stop the damage, I guess.
Because I can guarantee you that the 1776 project, if schools honestly are even around long enough for that to seriously be implemented, I can assure you it's going to be as absurd, if not more absurd, the way that it attempts to paint history.
Oh,
In contrast with the 1619 doctrine. What
you
were you
know
going to say,
how,
Heretic?
yeah, you know how Plato was black? Well, Diogenes was American.
Yeah, turns out Plato invented McDonald's, which would make sense because pretty much everything in the world that is wrong can be traced back to Plato, and McDonald's fucking sucks. So
Fuck. And in addition to that, the ancient African empires of Ghana, yeah, those were founded by Americans too. Man,
yeah, other governments in the world only exist because of the U.S.'s empire. It's also not. It's also not an empire. It's the freest state in the world. You can have freer states than other states.
it's our freedom is so powerful it transcends space and time. So such that we were able to found and bring democracy to other countries retroactively.
At the same time, our rights were gifts from George Washington, who was just terrified of the world as he saw it around him, and decided, because he was the one altruistic, genuinely good, honest person, he decided, I'm gonna give you rights, and then he penned the Constitution, and America was born.
Yeah, you know the Athenian democracy? Yeah, that was Ben Franklin. He just the whole you know that whole catching lightning on the or catching lightning from a kite thing, that urban legend. That's not only true, but that was also his form of time travel. He formed the Athenian democracy and then came back in time to, and then went back to found the United States, and then went back to the 20th century to make sure that they were able to get his photo on the $100 bill. And
Yeah,
that's what happened. And if you try to correct me on that, then you are objectively wrong, and you need to be put into our concentration camp.
no, and I that actually probably is a pretty close representation of something that will be in the 1776 project, because I am old enough to remember education prior to the 1619 project really being everywhere, and I distinctly remember in second grade unironically being taught that Ben Franklin invented electricity. I'm not even fucking kidding. Like that actually was something that was in I I think it was a textbook. It it actually said that, but I don't remember if it was a textbook or it was like some like movie made for school documentary.
I think I'm pretty sure what they meant to say is that he was the first one to really use electricity in the way that we would use it now. However, that's clearly not true, as the existence of the Baghdad battery indicates. In addition to the fact that, well, I mean, lightning struck the Earth several times before Ben Franklin was ever even born. So the idea that he just willed lightning or electricity into existence would probably put him on the level of, would probably make him a god, or at least some kind of reality warping entity. I like what
But
Omen Rose said it best. Ben Franklin was Zeus.
Yeah, so look out for stuff like that because I'm pretty sure that that's what the 1776 project is going to consist of. It wouldn't surprise me honestly if the 1776 project was just what the government was already teaching people, but now everybody loves it because it's striking back against the 1619 project.
You remember when you were taught when you were going over the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression in your social studies class, and they were talking about how Herbert Hoover was a voluntarist who just asked companies to just start hiring more people to get them out of the Great Depression, but otherwise did literally nothing else.
Yeah, that wasn't me, but somebody in our server posted a screenshot of their textbook and it said that.
Well, I mean, I wasn't recalling that specifically. However, I can say that I did personally experience that myself. So, yeah, that is something that is genuinely being told, and the idea that they would now try to reframe that as somehow patriotic is going to come off as pretty hilarious to me, especially like once people realize, or once the scales come off and people start to realize that most of what they've been taught about American history is absolute nonsense. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant. Who would have thought?
So I'm gonna say so. I guess I could paraphrase, but not paraphrase, but I guess I can end this topic with something that's extremely spicy, but it does lead into the topic of the stream. I think that the Enlightenment has done more harm to modern science than pretty much any other trend. I will elaborate if people ask about it because I know that's a pretty fucking spicy take. I was actually planning on making a video about that because I know that is a really on its like from a superficial perspective that is a really that's a really hot take. But
yeah,
trust me, the I actually do have some pretty pretty good argument to support that. Anyway, so the reason that okay, well, I guess that leads us into the video that we were going to talk about today. I guess continuing on the subject of what I believe the last stream was, where we were talking about skeptics. I fucking hate skeptics, and this is another thing that I can cast onto the fire of the skeptics.
Yeah, we were talking about skeptics in I think 2 streams ago, specifically in regard to Undoomed, and him showing very much an example of the deterioration of the skeptic community, which I wouldn't say it's really a deterioration, but just more along the lines of a recognition of the skeptic community being I guess you could say, or what would be the best term to describe something that's like really a shell has a whole lot on the surface but has no substance inside? What would be the proper term for that? Yeah, that's a husk of of content. And what we show with Undoomed is that while his presentation is absolutely freaking phenomenal, his substance is non-existent. Basically, he just spends 7 minutes playing 1 to 2 second clips a of some SJW saying something silly, and then their immediate reply is just, "You're dumb, you're a moron, you're idiot, you have a small brain," and that's basically the entire video.
The reason that the skeptic movement is like that, sort of, it traces back even to the ancient Greek skeptic movement, or just the skeptic movements throughout history, which, for those who don't know, the skeptic movement is essentially just an ongoing tradition that's well over 2,500 years old. But at any given time, it is basically people questioning conventions in the scientific method, or at least that's how it's branded. It's taking specific like narratives people have and questioning whether or not the axioms are valid. However, the problem though with the skeptic movement is that they're not making any sort of claim to truth. So, but you could sort of take away from being basically a skeptic is a meaningless term. It doesn't actually describe any sort of coherent position. It's the you're not my dad of philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And this thing is, well, going to be another good example. Trying to give people who would self-identify as skeptics a guide on how they should determine what their interests are or who to vote for and why voting would be a good idea in the first place. And since the 2020 election is coming up, this is pretty topical, and it's going to become more topical as we approach November 3rd.
Just what I was going to say about the skeptic movement is because there's no, from their perspective, there's no coherent claim. There's no limit to the things you could take away from the skeptic perspective, which, in a sense, is a good thing in that it lowers sort of the barrier to entry or what actually is required to talk about philosophy so more people can contribute. However, because there's not actually any sort of, there's no way to contribute anything of substance as a skeptic, you get a lot more, vapid nonsense than you do anything that's actually meaningful in terms of contributing to the discussion.
Sorry if I'm
Yeah.
quiet, just that I was looking away for a moment.
All right, but the channel that we're looking at today is carnities.org, which, I mean, for those of you who, are students of philosophy watching this channel or have Googled topics that we've discussed on the stream or in one of our videos on the Backalley Philosophy channel previously, you've probably run into this guy's channel because for the most part he makes he makes essays, well, not essays, but basic summaries of philosophical concepts and axioms and math and stuff like that. So, and he is relatively accurate in terms of what he's actually describing, though, make what you will of the concepts that he's talking about. Sometimes he describes the philosophy of, people who I personally really admire the work of, like Gottlob Frege and Ludwig Wittgenstein. And sometimes he talks about people who, I absolutely despise, like Schopenhauer and Hegel. But what do you think, Heretic?
I mean, I haven't followed this guy at all. Maybe I've seen his work once or twice, but I'm kind of in the same position where I was before, where I haven't watched a video. Not because I don't do any preparations for these streams, but simply because that I think it's actually more entertaining if I gave my honest reaction to seeing this content for the first time, not, do any preparation. So it's a lot more, impactful, or I don't know what the terms would be. Just basically, it's a lot more off the cuff and more genuine, I guess you could say. Not that anything you would say beforehand, like from watching the stream beforehand, isn't going to be genuine, but just that, yeah, I think it's more of a stylistic choice. So as far as I can tell, yeah, I'm kind of going into this largely blind.
But I don't know. I guess if you want a good summary of Aristotelian model logic, then this is a good place to go. It's the best that in terms of summaries that you can find on YouTube. He put out this video, how skeptics vote, And not only would I argue, is it not very skeptical, even from the perspective of what it means for something to be a skeptic in what they claim their tradition is dedicated to, but it also is it's full of quite a few hot takes. Which is not normal for this channel, because most of this channel's content is just value-free evaluations of positions put forward by well-known philosophers.
Usually, if that's the case, then either this guy's showing off like his actual biases, his actual understanding, his actual somewhat flawed understandings of reality, and then putting it forward, or he's making a video specifically to address a very specific audience, and as a result, it's going to be as flawed and as, well, juicy as you described. So anyway, should we get started?
Sure.
All right,
We've been talking for like 40 minutes.
Well, yeah. Honestly, that's actually pretty good anyways.
Welcome back to Carnatic.org. Today we're going to be starting a new mini two-part series on how skeptics vote. Now, given the upcoming U.S. election, we're going to look at answering the question of how skeptics vote, particularly Pyrrhonian skeptics like myself with no beliefs. This will cover two videos. This first video will look at...
Well, and that's something that I guess we should probably we should probably address right off the bat. There's no such thing as not having a belief system.
Yeah, I don't know if that's even possible. Like, is this guy just a straight nihilist? Or are they just approaching this from the question of the Socratic method, where they don't know anything and just continually try to press people with questions just to try to figure out some understanding of the truth? The difference between nihilists and Socrates is that Socrates knew that truth existed. He just wasn't sure that other people had even a pretense of the truth, or had at least an understanding enough of what they said to be characterized as truth.
What I think that people like this guy are intending when they say things like this. But whether or not you're right or wrong, it's literally like, in order to process information, you need to build narratives about that information and its implications for other things that you've observed. It's not possible to not believe anything. In fact, that's sort of an inherently paradoxical position. Not believing something is itself a belief.
Yeah, I can see that that does make sense.
So the reason why a lot of people would like to argue that they don't believe anything, I think, is because it allows them to actually discuss nature and discuss philosophy without actually having to encounter the conflicts that entails. So it's kind of a position that I have no respect for. Yes, because that logically, like I was talking about earlier, that logically concludes with debate and discussion becoming meaningless. Everything that you say about nature, or every criticism that you make about nature, is presupposed. And if we are going to assume that your methodology is valid, then there's no way. You're essentially, it's not that you don't believe anything, it's just that you're framing your position as though it's somehow illegitimate to question the axioms that you're attempting to ascribe to reality. So it's like, oh, I can criticize you, but if you criticize me, you're wrong. I don't even know why people take this seriously. be perfectly frank.
You honestly,
that's like something that that's like something a 5-year-old would try and pull.
You just constantly throw the why question without being able to explain anything, or even being able to give any information as to how you might be able to interpret it. I mean, the Socratic method is not only useful for figuring out information, but it's also a good framing device to try to lead people towards a conclusion using certain questions that whose answer leads towards that question. I mean, in one of the Socratic dialogues, particularly the most famous one about the allegory of the cave, I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with that one. It wasn't really explained. It was Socrates using a whole bunch of leading questions about that described the cave and how people would act in that situation. And that's the allegory. It's just a bunch of questions asked by Socrates. So naturally, if you're going to be going with the Socratic method, you naturally have to be making a whole bunch of assumptions and have a whole bunch of beliefs. Most importantly, that you can use questioning in general as a framing device to lead people towards your conclusion. So again, that's just another.
I want to discuss the nature of reality like a big kid, and I want to get all the admiration and respect that comes with that. But I don't want to actually put in the work of trying to explain nature, and I don't want to have disagreements with other people who may conflict with my interpretations of reality. Guess I'm just gonna try and have my cake and eat it too.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you really want the admiration and respect that Socrates got? Sure, you could argue he's immortal, but keep in mind he was suicided by the state, so yeah, generally you want to avoid being Clinton. Anyways,
honestly, the only Greek philosopher who actually deserved any respect was Aristotle, and he was the one that history has not been kindest to.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of hot takes that come from Aristotle, namely his physics and astronomy. But anyways, we should at least continue.
Generally, how it is possible for someone without beliefs to vote in an election, which is often framed as being about your beliefs about a particular candidate or their policies.
Apparently, skeptics are just people who don't have any beliefs at all, which is, I think, a ridiculous way to characterize the skeptic community. You watch any video from a so-called skeptic, it's very clear that they have a lot of very prominent beliefs. Perhaps most hilariously, it's that feminists are dumb. And I don't think it really goes, for a lot of them, I don't really think it goes much further than that. Or if you're undoomed, it's because feminists are morons. But other than that, and the various liberalist beliefs that get pushed forward by certain authoritarians, yeah, they definitely do have beliefs. It's almost certain that they do. I don't know where I don't know if this is like a attempt to put forward his own ideas of skepticism. If he's honestly trying to trick us into thinking that people like Sargon of Akkad don't have any beliefs at all, or is this just one of those like no true Scotsman? Well, a true skeptic wouldn't have any beliefs whatsoever.
Yeah, and aside from just explaining how that's not even possible earlier, this would be a great example of where, of a problem that emerges with the skeptic movement, because there's no way to actually genuinely question nature of anything that's been asked, because any axiom that you use or attempt to rebut, you're either employing that axiom or your rebuttal is based on pure presupposition. You actually do have limits as a skeptic to the amount of things that you can be skeptical of. And you are not ever going to be capable of realizing that, because your entire worldview stops at these sort of arbitrary limits, which you're not being honest enough to actually inquire about. Voting would be a good example of this. Now, everybody watching would probably be of the mindset that if you were to follow the sort of skeptic methodology, wouldn't that naturally conclude with anti-politics? After all, wouldn't you have to ask the question of, does voting actually influence society? You know, are legislative decrees actually dictated by popular policy demands? Does the popularity of a policy demand determine it, or is it something else? Why is that the case? Isn't the state a coherent organization? In which case, why isn't the state's actions determined by whatever the state deems to be a way of pursuing its interests? And Shane Killian he's made this point on, an episode about skepticism before, that skeptics reject the state. He's tried to draw that parallel, but honestly, skeptics sort of draw the line at, whatever they're least willing to question. And because there's nothing inherently that would cause them to question these things, people like this guy get to voting and they just think, oh, well, Hobbes' social contract theory is valid, so it's not worth questioning it. The state is just us. We are the state. Or, however other of the numerous ways that authoritarians have attempted to justify the state over the years.
Mm-hmm. And there have been, as Shane Killian, but also others of dubious quality, have attempted to point out with made some pretty good arguments about how if you're going to be skeptical about God because you're edgy atheists, and the way to really get clout is to go after those evil, horrible, terrible Christians, then naturally all those arguments would also have to apply to the state. What is the state? Have you ever seen the state? Have you ever touched the state? Can you interact with the state? Is the state the Capitol building? Is it the Washington Monument? No, those are just buildings. Is Donald Trump the state? No, he's just a guy with a glorified title and an R enclosed in parentheses next to his name. So what is the state? I guess you could say it doesn't exist. Well, I mean, exists in the a priori sense, but for the most part, you can't really demonstrate that it has any legitimate power. And once you really start to get into it, I mean, I think what it is that it's the way indoctrination. They're indoctrinated into it, and they were probably inspired into atheism in general by someone else they really looked up to, but they don't really understand enough about skepticism to be able to apply it internally into or even be able to recognize any other biases or religious beliefs that they can very strongly hold. And I do genuinely believe that statism is a religion. Those were the first 4 words I used on the first video of my YouTube channel. Statism is a religion. And that's what I think it is. You have a whole bunch of people who have a very hard time trying to shake off the beliefs that they were inculcated into by their school teachers, by their parents, by society around them. It's a continuous reinforcement, and one that's only escalated significantly as the state approaches the end of its life cycle for the first time in ever.
Yeah, a very harmful assumption I think that a lot of people make about cults is that cults are strictly religious. And in reality, cults are characterized essentially by the sort of social structures which they engineer to manipulate people in a sort of Pavlovian fashion. And, that does not require religion in the same way that the state does not require religion. Religion is a particularly helpful tool, but there are plenty of secular belief systems which operate near identically to cults. Climate alarmism, Marxism, Freudianism would be examples of that, where they're sort of a clearly defined figurehead. They claim to have all the answers about everything, but nothing they say could ever be tested. And the way that they appeal to people is not even really so much based on what they're explaining, but rather what they're claiming following this belief system will give people.
Mm-hmm.
And the state is sort of the ultimate secular cult, I would argue. But
another good example another good example of what you're talking about is, I remember, I think it was like a year ago, I was watching like one of those r/ videos where people just read Reddit posts, because sometimes they can be mildly entertaining. But this one was about or asking people what their experience was, or people who have left a cult. What was your experience like? And what struck me is that well over half, like, you got your usual examples, like people who left Scientology, people who left the what are they called? The Not really important. But what struck me is that half of the people who claim they left a cult actually have left businesses which they described as having very cult-like atmospheres, which of course required them to cut off contact with their family, to regard their CEO, their boss, as some sort of great figureheads, this wonderful leader, and all sorts of other shenanigans like that. And it's like, yeah, you don't really need to be a religion. It doesn't really need to be religion, but people just assume. And this is another thing about the beliefs that you were talking about earlier, that these people don't have no belief. They have the belief that the religion of statism is not a religion, when this is clearly not the case.
It's definitely not a cult, because you can vote. Or if you happen to live in a state where that's not the case, you could just leave. Just like in Scientology, where if you don't like it, you can leave.
Yeah, you can leave. You just have to pay them a huge exorbitant fee and cut off contact with a huge number of people in your life. But you can just leave, And this totally is not a justification we're attempting to construct to explain away all of the really horrible and manipulative things we've done to you in the past. Everything is fine because you can just leave.
For those who don't know, it's still kind of bugs me that I run into people who don't recognize the problem with that argument. The problem is that you don't have to justify your disassociation. That's a misplacement of the burden of proof. It's not, oh, well, there's an expat tax. Aside from the U.S., the only other state in the world that has an expat tax is Eritrea. So,
yeah,
which is some bumfuck country in Africa. I had to actually look up on fucking maps to know where it was. So that's not a good argument.
Mm-hmm. Even then, it's just like, if you can use that but you can move argument to justify literally anything. If I punch you in the face repeatedly every day, I can justify it by just saying, well, if you don't want me to punch you in the face, you can just leave, and I'll never find you again. I'll never be able to punch you in the face. Is that at all a justification for the fact that I am blatantly committing assault against you? Of course not. But for some reason, whenever statists are presented with this very fact that they are engaging in victimization against us and against them, then this is brought forward as an argument that somehow makes sense to them, which, yeah, you can only do that if you subscribe to your irrationality, unironically.
Well, it's also another problem with it as well is sort of like when people respond to skepticism about police brutality with, oh, well, look at these statistics. It's not that bad. They don't understand the criticism as well, because sort of implicit in that response, why don't you just leave, is the assumption that we're talking about sort of actions that exist in a bubble. And as I've sort of explained in great length in the past, a big part of why anyone is skeptical of the state, more times than not, has to do with these structures that the state has built in society to reinforce its interests, which necessitate using coercive measures against people in order either to socially engineer them to do things they otherwise wouldn't want to do, or to just straight up extract resources from them through violence. So there is the skepticism of political authority is really a skepticism of a great inequality of authority that exists in society. This is something Roderick Long's written quite a bit about. He has an essay talking about it. Equality, the Unknown Ideal. You can find it on Mises. I reference him because these are things that I plan on writing about eventually, but haven't yet. So it's sort of, I'm sure some people are curious, but I don't want to derail the discussion chasing that subject.
And people in the chat are just asking about who has the Boomer Holocaust in the background. That would be, is it okay to say?
Sure.
Yeah, that's Quispy. We've actually been voice chatting for a bit, and this has been going on for several weeks. As far as we can tell, he does not have the Boomer Holocaust, and he is otherwise fine. He just got this nasty cough.
Yeah, I've been around him since he's gotten it, and yeah, nothing's happened to me or anybody else here. So, if it were the Boomer Holocaust, we definitely would be showing some symptoms now. Either that, or I have like Arnold Schwarzenegger of immune systems.
I mean, I know that you're young, so there's a good chance that you're probably just going to be asymptomatic. I mean, I have a reasonable assumption that I actually did get it at some point, but one, I'm not going to get tested because I know that the government's going to keep that information and use it against me. And two, all that really happened is I coughed and sneezed a little bit for like a few hours.
Yeah, I'm sort of in the same place where I'm pretty sure that I've gotten it a couple of times actually, just for the sheer like amount of times that I've gone out and associated with people with how easy it supposedly is to catch COVID and how widespread it is. There's no way I haven't at least come into contact with it. It's just I've never had a day where I was like bedridden since this whole thing has started. So either I've caught it and didn't even realize I had it, or I've come into contact with it, but I didn't even catch it somehow.
All right. So, anyways, we kind of got off the top a little bit. So, should we continue?
Sure.
Next video will apply these principles to the current election and include my personal endorsement for who I'm voting for in the 2020 U.S. presidential election.
Should we say who we're going to vote for, or should we wait until like later in the stream?
You can wait, I guess.
All right. Yeah, we're going to make our official announcement as to who me and Esso are going to vote for in this election. And if you're on the Discord, there's a very good chance you probably already know, but we're going to make our official announcement here later. So anyways, continuing.
Elections. While one may withhold belief in unjustified claims, one may not withhold action. For failing to act is an act itself.
No. Literally no.
It's like you're saying that inaction is the same as action.
It's literally not, though.
I don't even know where to begin addressing that one.
Well, this is essentially, this is the reasoning that people attempt to use to scare people into vooting. Sort of like, I don't know, I guess if we were to draw another comparison to religion, people scaring people into the belief system by threatening them with Sheol or hell, whatever you want to call it. But I think we've talked about this in the past before, but no, inaction is not the same thing as action. Actually, we were just talking about that not even 5 minutes ago, where specifically what's wrong with that is that's just the burden of proof fallacy. I do not have to justify inaction because my inaction is not proof of anything. My inaction does not contribute to anything. There's a lot, and if we were going to use that standard, there would be, there'd be no limit to the amount of things that one could be scrutinized for, up to things which contradict themselves. Why aren't you inventing a time machine, for instance, or why aren't you on the moon?
There's an infinite number of things that you are not doing at this very moment. And if you spent all your time scrutinizing and trying to justify all the things you're not doing, you wouldn't have enough time in your lifetime to be able to do anything. And that's even assuming you live for 1,000,000 years. Forget a million, trillion. The point is that it's impossible to be in compliance with the principle that that negative action requires justification, or even some principle that leads to that conclusion, such as that that inaction is the same as action, which is the failure to act as an act itself. So I'm pretty sure where this is going to go is if you don't vote for Trump, then you're voting for Biden.
Or the other way around, maybe, but that's sort of, that's essentially the abstracted version of this argument. Don't vote, then you're voting for X candidate I don't like. And, this is the formulation of that argument, just sort of the basic logical version of it, where where we've stripped it out of everything other than just just a basic model logic form. This is the kind of this is what you're supposed to see this argument as it's written in a model logic, and then realize that it's wrong. So it kind of baffles me, actually, that he's proposing that version of the argument and expressing absolutely no skepticism towards it. As a skeptic, no less. A self-proclaimed one, at least.
Well, he seems to be acting on the basis of belief, and therefore contradicting his earlier claim that he has no belief, since he clearly believes that failing to act is the same as acting. So, isn't that a belief?
Yeah. I'm not even going to mention that every time that he says something, because that'll get old really quickly. But essentially, every time he makes a statement, he's contradicting the first claim of the video, which is that he has no beliefs.
Basically, if we were to make this into a video essay, we would need to have a counter on screen to showcase the number of times where he contradicts his initial introduction by saying that he has no belief, by counting all the times that he states a belief. But in all honesty, that counter would have to be silent, because the whole video would just be beep 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 beep.
Heretic turns into a protogen.
That's actually probably going to happen in the not too distant future.
Well,
anyways, where's the thing? There it is.
The skeptic withholds belief or assent to particular propositions or ideas, but may act even without full information or full knowledge, because not acting is itself often an action.
Here's
if someone's about to fall off.
Here's another question: why is voting the only action?
Because our almighty state said so.
See, that's a great example of another one of those sort of baseline premises that he starts with that is actually extremely controversial. As a skeptic, he should be questioning. It's because skeptic philosophy doesn't actually allow people, doesn't actually give them tools to question axioms and claims about nature. There is no way for him to actually question whether or not, within his internal perspective, voting, that dichotomy where there's just voting for this person or voting for the other person, not voting, it is not an option. There's just those two options. And I bet, if you were to tell him about counter economics, I would blow his fucking brain. But
let me tell you exactly what he would say. Well, do you think that you can convince all of society to adopt counter economics ideologically?
I love how much explanatory power counter economics has.
Well, I mean, I've also heard that argument so many goddamn times that it's just become so predictable.
It's like the only response to people who don't just realize immediately, oh, that's actually better than the political system. That seems to be the only response to it is, oh, well, people need to believe this in order for counter economics to actually change society. And no, literally no. That's sort of that's the first fundamental point that Konkin proposed in any proposition of counter economics. And what actually changes society is people subverting these institutions that the state has set up around its interests. So, no, belief is kind of irrelevant there.
It showcases their continued hold that the state has on their minds, that they still unironically believe that in order to get their way, they essentially have to operate not necessarily through democracy, but just through a very democratized methodology that requires majority agreement or majority rule.
Need to convince people that you're right, because the only way to actually have law is just if everybody agrees with the law. That's what the state does. Just, ignore the fact that, from every perspective, by every way of measuring that you could conceive of, that is just an inherently nonsensical point, and it conflicts with the entire concept of the punitive justice as it's argued. Why do we need the state to have this monopoly on security and essentially just lock people up for committing crimes instead of actually compensating people who were victimized? Well, because we need to get these criminals off the street. Oh, I thought everybody agreed with the law. How could there be criminals then?
Potatoes. Oh, I know what's going on, actually. It's because, you see, there's a whole bunch of people who didn't actually agree with the social contract from the very beginning. They were only pretending to agree with us. It's these bad people, you see, who just don't agree with the social contract. And if we just, empower a coercive monopoly with our coercive monopoly and arbitration to get rid of all the bad people who don't agree with the social contract by putting them into a cage for the rest of their lives where they can network with other people who disagree with the social contract. And just ignore that. But if we just lock them away, then everything will be perfect. We'll have utopia, I promise.
What were you going to say?
No, continue.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that that's sort of that's a leftover from the sort of political mentality that the state tries to push onto people since they're young enough that they actually can learn.
All right. Should we continue? Because it sounds
in the background.
Yeah, it's pretty loud actually. It's not like very loud, but it's noticeable. Anyways, continuing.
For bridge. The act of not saving them is itself an action with real consequences and real ethical implications.
This guy doesn't really understand ethics, which I think we touched upon earlier. If you didn't catch it, he's trying to put forward the example, and I think you can read it on screen. If someone is about to fall off a bridge, the act of not saving them is itself an action with real consequences. Yes, it has real consequences, but you're not obligated to help them. I know it sounds very cruel and cold-hearted to say, but someone else is doing something does not enslave you to respond to it. You're still in free will. You still have the ability to decide for yourself the action you're going to take in response to, that particular stimuli. If you don't, then,
That's the problem with assuming that the burden of proof is resting upon a passive position. Because to take the example that's being provided here, what exactly would be the criteria for, you being criminally responsible for the person falling off the bridge? Is it closeness of proximity? Is it how closely related to the person you are? How well you know them? And in which case, why does that? Why is that the standard of proof?
Well, potatoes. I'm pretty sure that's just going to be the answer that they're always going to give. Not potatoes specifically, but just some answer that can basically be summed up as potatoes.
And but yeah, just I don't think that I have to go over how the option of not voting is not the only thing that you can do other than vote. Like, there are countless alternatives.
There's like an infinite number of things you could do other than vote. And are we still on for the election day election non-coverage stream?
I was planning on it, except I'm not sure what we're going to do.
Yeah, basically what I had in mind is that we're going to try to marathon a game for the duration of the polls being open. We don't have to play one game, but we can just play games for the entirety that the polls are open, so people can have something to watch and listen while they're not voting. Maybe have the audio in the background while they're doing something else while they're not voting. Although I know that there's going to be some troll who's going to have this played in the background, or at least have that stream played in the background, listening to it on their phones while they're in the polling place. But yeah, you can't really control for that. But at least I'm resigned to the knowledge that any trolls who are going to vote, ironically because of us, their votes aren't really going to matter, so they're just wasting their time, which is no concern of mine. So yeah.
Yeah, they're playing themselves because they just wasted all of their time, effort, and psychological strength investing themselves into a system that doesn't give a shit about them.
And is ultimately just going to manipulate them into conflating their interests and their goals with the continuation and power of the state. So ultimately, they're resigning themselves to an utterly ineffective and worthless praxis that does literally nothing except manipulate them psychologically. I guess that's their choice to make. I'm just saying it's not the smartest one.
If they think that in that situation we would be the ones being trolled, then they're mistaken.
Yeah. So anyways, let's continue.
A skeptic may suspend belief as to whether or not they are going to fall off the bridge, but may still act out of the fear that they might fall off the bridge, out of the hope that they might be able to save them. Therefore, while the skeptic suspends judgment on who the better candidate is, or what that candidate will do in office, they may still vote without beliefs. As either voting or not voting is taking an action, which, like saving someone on a bridge, may have serious consequences. In this video, we're going to cover...
That assumes that the outcome of an election actually changes the agenda of the state.
Oh, no. But, Esso, don't you know? This is the most important consequential election ever. 2020 is going to change absolutely everything. So was the 2018 election, which was the most important election since the 2016 election, which is the most important since 2014, and so on and so forth. Ad infinitum. I wonder how many...
Every election season, and this is something that I think a lot of people are beginning to realize, which is why anarchy is sort of growing in popularity. But, a lot more people have just been around long enough to have been able to sort of look at their social media feeds from 4 to 8 years ago, and these platforms have existed long enough for people to be able to do that, and they've sort of gotten to where they can look at currently compare what they're saying to past elections and realize, well, I really was saying the exact same thing about 2012 that I am right now, or 2016 that I am right now.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I recall a time when I was unironically arguing that certain election cycle was the most important election in our lifetime, and candidate was going to absolutely destroy society as we know it if he was not if he was or was not elected. So
a candidate who is going to destroy society, of course, changing depending upon whatever perceived interests you have, mainly time preference.
Pretty much. And suffice to say, candidate did not win, and surprise, surprise, things remained largely the same. The government continued to prey on people. The government continued foreign wars of aggression. There were still economic restrictions. It was still very difficult to act economically. Artificial scarcities were still going on. Basically, it was business as usual. Nothing really changed. And I'm pretty sure this is something that a lot of Obama supporters figured out in 2008 and 2012 as well. Well, it's also something that I think I remember Stefan Molyneux actually made a tweet about this in 2017 or 2016 after the Democrat primary, and we saw a reprise of this in 2020 where the average individual donation to Bernie Sanders was $37. $37 basically bought all Bernie Sanders supporters a education on Democrat politics, where ultimately your choice doesn't really matter, but they give you the illusion specifically so that you can direct your anger towards other people rather than towards the people who are actually controlling things, who are actually pulling the strings against the if you turn your attention towards the people who are being ruled over rather than the rulers themselves, well, let's just say that the only people who really benefit from that are the rulers themselves. It's just a horizontal conflict rather than a real vertical one, which could actually, change things.
It's like that meme that was making fun of the sort of the Chaz situation earlier this year, where it's someone who very clearly, well, it's like a cartoon, someone who very clearly was from the king's palace is going to some peasant's house with it holding a torch, saying, "This guy, your neighbor over here, is causing all these problems. Let's go burn his shit down." Yeah, and then they're burning this guy's house down, and the king's watching in the background, eating popcorn.
Yeah, I remember that one. It's pretty glorious. Anyways, continuing.
On a bridge may have serious consequences. In this video, we're going to cover 3 justifications a skeptic can use to determine who to vote for: alternative propositional attitudes, limiting dogma, and self-preservation.
Limiting dogma, talking about voting. I mean, you can't use those two in the same sentence. Those are mutually exclusive.
It's going to be amusing to listen to him attempt to justify how those two things don't contradict one another.
Oh, don't worry. He won't even. He has a grand strategy for how to avoid this completely. All he has to do to make the ethical and contradictory problems not a problem is to just pretend they don't exist.
Pretty much.
It works perfectly, I promise. Anyways, playing.
So propositional attitudes are attitudes that a subject has towards a proposition. If you want more on propositions, sentences, statements, I have a video on truth makers and truth bearers that might be interesting to you. But for now, let's say propositions, just basically sentences or statements that you can assent to. Belief is the propositional attitude that you are assenting to the truth of a statement. You believe that a statement is true. It's the proposition.
Hold on a second. So this is what you were talking about earlier with belief, or the lack of belief being a belief. Hello?
Yeah, I heard what you said, but it's just in the context. What your response is this is what I was talking about earlier. Well, I guess in what way, I would ask, because I said a lot of things about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, he remarked on that he has no beliefs, and you just remarked that believing that you have no belief is itself a belief. Yeah. So he is very clearly just demonstrating what you're talking about. Anyways, I'm just going to backtrack a bit before we continue.
Are assenting to the truth of a statement. You believe that a statement is true.
So,
it's the propositional attitude that philosophers...
I'm glad that you did backtrack, because I almost didn't catch that, and I don't know how I didn't catch that. But he's saying that belief in a statement makes it true. I mean, that is quite literally fundamentalist thinking now. Like this is like Plato applied to Christianity kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think I missed that. Let me just see that one more time.
To the truth of a statement. You believe that a statement is true. It's the propositional attitude that philosophers...
Oh, I see. He's making a subjective truth statement. That statements can only be epistemologically correct or true if you believe it to be the case. Implying that...
the attitude that really that leads me to believe that relativist perspectives on any subject are sort of the most evil thing that's ever existed and need to be weeded out of the sciences.
Nihilism, I've said for a long time, nihilism, which moral or ethical and epistemological subjectivism are a form of, nihilism is a mind cancer. I would even go so far as to say it's a soul cancer, but it's definitely a mind cancer. It ultimately kills people's ability to conceive of reality, and once people don't believe any sort of truth could possibly exist, they forfeit their ability to be able to interact and participate in any meaningful way. It's just ultimately detrimental for them.
I was saying earlier, it's worse than that. It's not, it doesn't, that's one thing that it does, I guess. It restricts your ability to sort of comprehend reality, but more so than anything, it constructs a rhetorical device where anything that you're saying doesn't have to be justified, yet it can be allowed to sort of circulate into the discussion about the nature of reality and be treated like a serious opinion.
And funnily enough, their quote-unquote serious opinion lacks any ability to not only make any truth statements about reality by their own admission, but you also forfeit the ability to refute any claims to the contrary. If you say that there is no such thing as objective truth, ignoring the fact that you're making a completely contradictory statement by putting forward a proposition that argues that there is objectively true that there is no such thing as objective truth, even if we ignore that completely, and you say that there is no such thing as objective truth on its own, then you have no ability to say that there is objective truth. You have no ability to claim that I am wrong. It's just, as far as you're concerned, a preference. I don't even know why you would even put that forward, because you're basically wasting your time trying to make a serious debate about your favorite color.
If nihilism were taken to its logical conclusion and allowed to sort of dominate sciences, well, I guess that may not be the appropriate word to use, but if it ever did dominate in the sciences, we wouldn't go back to the Stone Ages, because, whether or not we understand it, the industrial production which sort of creates modernity would still exist. But our understanding of nature certainly would. We would be going back to, like, the humors to try and cure medicine, and possibly even prior to that.
I don't even know if we would go that far, because at that point, like, the humors hypothesis would have exactly as much validity in terms of its ability to cure ailments as would just throwing rocks at people. That would be equally as valid a form of healing. And the same could be true for any other field. The best we could hope for if nihilism became mainstream in the sciences is stagnation, because people would fundamentally lack and forfeit the ability to make any truth claims or truth statements about reality. They're therefore forfeiting the ability to make any theories, form any hypotheses, do any experiments, because fundamentally you can't do the scientific method if you forfeit any ability to form any conclusions from it. So the best that would happen is stagnation. The worst that would happen is, as you said earlier, regress. And I think it would be a lot worse than even you put forward.
Oh, I'm sure that it would.
And I think very quickly that
authoritarianism itself is based on a form of relativism. It's based on the relativism of political authority. Political authority is seen from the perspective of the authoritarian, or the old, I guess, the old world rightist, if you want to, put it a different way. That the state is just this sort of, it's either this value-free, value-neutral organization, or whatever its interests have is necessarily the interest of everybody else, so it can't be questioned, to the point where if it's proposing something that is literally impossible, like the examples throughout history of the state trying to decree that math problems are written a certain way, and more recently, the state has tried to decree that cryptography is illegal. So effectively the same thing, but a more relevant type of that same thing. So even then, the state is just right. Why? Because I don't know. The divine right that voting has, the divine right to vote that people have. Like literally, I've heard statists on more than one occasion. Actually, it's quite common to hear them refer to voting as something that's sacred. Like that's the terminology they'll use.
I'm reasonably sure that God did not did not curse us with having our rights taken from us by people that we are given the so-called right to choose. And if so, that would mean that we have a certain sect or a certain set of divine right of kings, only instead the divine right is selected by majority rule. And that's assuming you take the democracy thing completely seriously, which is clearly not the case. They put forward the term sacred only insofar as they believe that democracy is great and wonderful and perfect, and everything that isn't democracy is not perfect and therefore bad. It's very common, I would see, in a lot of in statism nowadays, where democracy is just considered to be the end all be all of political organization and the ultimate good.
Which is why I maintain that one of the most important thought experiments that you could propose to a statist is to imagine a world where there was only one state. Because if there was only one state, then all of the literally, like, not all the justifications, but like 90 to 95% of the authoritarian justifications for the state would just fall apart on their face. Why don't you just leave? Well, there's a state and it's everywhere. Well, this state is more free than another state. Well, obviously that's not true. There's no other state. So how do you talk about rights or freedom as concepts then from the authoritarian perspective?
Well, you see, Esso, our rights come from the world government. And without the world government, we would not have any rights whatsoever. So you should be grateful to your rulers for letting you exercise their rights, because they can just take that away from you anytime. I mean, you're not showing insufficient gratitude, are you, citizen?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying though. Like that argument would fall apart because it sort of it takes the only way that even works in concept is because it's sort of implied that, oh well, there are all these other states and these states are barbaric in comparison.
I remember this one cartoon that showcases like our noble ruler, our glorious armies, our great religion, and our noble explorers. And then on the other side of the river, it showcases like literally identical figures, but with with a slight color swap. Only they're captioned completely differently. They're evil despoilers. They're heathen cults. They're evil despot. That kind of thing.
Now, and that's sort of my point, and that's the reason why, in a sense, the political authorities that exist, like the concept of the one world government, that's one of the reasons why I'm skeptical that would be in their interests, because a big part of the ways that political authorities in the world attempt to, well, they don't even offset, they don't even satisfy criticism. They just sort of obfuscate and offset criticism through jingoistic propaganda or by making these logically improper arguments framed around the assumption that it's valid. What they're doing is valid because somebody else is doing something that might arguably be worse, even though that's sort of questionable because, it's oftentimes like, well, okay, that country has a lower tax rate, but, they have, like, how do you even make that comparison?
I don't even know if you can. I mean, we all know that it's completely arbitrary, but it also showcases the extent to which a one world government would be impossible for the simple fact that they need an external threat. They need something to distract the population and to create anxiety in the population so that they can use that to justify the state in a way. It creates anxiety, and if you can position yourself as the alleviation of that anxiety, then you can position yourself you can justify yourself to the population in that kind of methodology. I'm pretty sure you've all seen those cartoons where this great superhero shows up and saves the country or saves the city, saves the whatever from a crisis, only for it to later turn out that the only reason that he's able to do this at all is because he knows he's manufacturing the crisis and happens to have exactly that kind of thing. I believe that was actually the plot of the first Incredibles, where Syndrome was going to set himself up in that way, basically unleash the robots that he had the remote to disable for, in order to set himself up as the world's last and true superhero. And that's largely what the state does. It creates enemies. It provokes the civilian population with fear of those enemies, and it sets itself up as the way to protect people from the enemies. You've seen this time after time after time. You have the Soviet Union and Stalin specifically, who justified himself in opposition to the fascists. The North Korean government justifies itself in opposition to the American and Japanese imperialists. You have the Americans, of course, who are trying to scare people about terrorism, and nowadays it's getting people to be scared of, well, it depends on which part of the Hegelian dialectic that you fall into. Either you're scared of the racists or you're scared of BLM. But the point is that they thrive on fear, and without that kind of fear, well, people are going to figure out very quickly that they don't actually need the government to maintain their interests, and as such, they're going to fall into forms of social arrangement that are significantly more profitable. Whereas
the other reason. Oh, okay. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't quite finished. What this more importantly does is that if you can justify political rule on that basis, then it also makes participation in your own enslavement a more pressing matter. Because if you don't vote, if you don't pay your taxes, if you don't be a good little boy, then you're necessarily acting in ways that provoke danger for from the rest of your neighbors. And so there's going to be a social impact to not paying your taxes, to not voting, to not doing all the things that the government wants you to do, because it's going to be very easy to frame you as someone who is putting the rest of society in danger. You're letting America fall to the terrorists. If you don't vote for George Bush, then you're siding with the terrorists. That kind of shenanigans.
Yeah, and that's that is pretty Orwellian the more that you think about it. In fact, that's pretty much exactly what Orwell was describing in 1984. But like the sort of social environment that the state manufactured. But just what I was going to say is that there's also there's a material side to why a one world government is not in the interests of the state, which is that the global central banking system that exists currently, which states require in order to have fiat currencies that they can sort of dictate and manipulate. I mean, there's a big part of the reason why, there is actually a core reason why states require central banks. And that is, it's two reasons. One, having central control of finance allows them to further manipulate the way that credit is invested and distributed. And that can allow them, with some extent, to manipulate business arrangements in the societies that they claim to have dominion over. So it allows them to control financial incentives to a large extent. Another reason why states need central banking is because literally, the more that states actually expand, which they're inherently incentivized to do, as a way of preserving themselves as parasitic entities. In order to do that, they're eventually going to resort to trying to create some sort of monopoly financial system as a way of controlling how much money, like having total control over the amount of money that's actually distributed into the society. So it's not just financial. It's not just a way to manipulate financial interests. It's literally that determining the way that supply is distributed is sort of something that the state needs to be able to do to a large extent. Where I was going with this is, if there's one government that would kind of stop the state from doing that, because a big part of how that system is able to sustain itself as is through governments pyramiding their fiat currencies off of global supply chains or other states. So, they make it so these states have to trade with the US dollar, for instance. And if they don't, then, they'll have a military coup, or they'll have some sort of financial penalty through one of the cartels that they're trading through. And the other reason, aside from central banking, are, the aforementioned cartel, corporate globalization cartels that the state sets up, like the Trilateral Commission, the World Trade Organization, or the IMF, which essentially cartelize supply chains and would allow the state, and do allow the state with a great deal of consistency to manipulate how much is needed in order for, how capital intense the production line itself is, in order to turn a profit on certain commodities, or who exactly are going to be the first people that have access to certain production line goods. So that wouldn't be able to exist if there was a single state either.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and I was just thinking, this also goes. I was just thinking about how this incentivizes state agents, particularly politicians, to think and act a certain way. It's very easy to imagine that the NSA is collecting data and collecting on the search history of politicians, search history of politicians' families, and then going over to sitting in their offices and then presenting them with this folder full of blackmail and just saying, don't worry, no one will ever see this as long as you play ball. But I can imagine that there's a more mundane thing that the state needs to do in order to get politicians to play ball. You just imagine that you're a congressperson or a senator, you go to your office and you see this guy who you don't know who he is, but he has this folder, and you sit down in your office and your staff introduces him to you, and he says that he's from the Federal Reserve. you're wondering what the hell he's doing here. And he says, "Hello, I am from the Federal Reserve, and I saw what you said in your campaign. Honestly, I understand where you're coming from in terms of wanting to end the Federal Reserve, but I think there's a lot of information that you're not aware of that you probably should be, and hopefully we can get you to change your opinion. Don't worry, I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm not here to scare you. No, your family is fine. Everything's going to be fine, but here's what you need to know. The government is screwed. It's been bankrupt for a long time, and the fact of the matter is, the fact that it even continues to exist in 2020 is nothing short of miraculous. In order to accomplish this, we've had to use the Federal Reserve in the ways that you have described predatory for a very long time. But it's absolutely necessary because in order to achieve your agenda as a congressperson, the government needs to continue to exist, and the only way it can continue to exist is for the Federal Reserve to continue printing money, to continue petrodollar recycling, to continue all the other stuff that you deem to be predatory. Now, your opinions on those are your own, and I respect that. However, hopefully, with this information and understanding that it is impossible for you to achieve any of the goals you seek to achieve by being elected into office in the first place, that you'll reconsider some of your positions. Here's my card, here's my number, and hopefully we can talk a little bit some more. Thank you for your time. And that's basically what happens. They're not intimidated. They're not scared. They're not given the run. They're not given a shakedown. They're just told the reality of the situation of the United States government and then reminded that their incentives are directly intertwined with that of the state, that they can't get any of the things that they want to get done for good or for ill done. Oh, we got a super chat.
Streamlabs a better donation method than either your Patreons. Heard Patreon has fees. Or perhaps direct crypto donations would be preferred for more regular donations?
He said,
anyways, thanks for the stream.
Heath Bombastic has donated $5. He asks if Streamlabs is a better donation method than Patreons because Patreon have fees, or doing direct crypto donations. I would recommend Streamlabs is probably a better donation method, and more importantly, you can control how much you give out rather than just having it be a monthly thing that constantly gets taken out of your account. But yeah, Patreon does have fees. Streamlabs does have fees too, but they're honestly not that bad. But yeah, crypto donations would also be fantastic. Which, speaking of which, SO, you should probably start including my crypto links into the descriptions too.
Okay, but yeah, I put crypto wallet IDs in the description of every Backalley video. So if anybody is interested in donating crypto to us, and they can feel free and do so. I can start putting heretics, specifically heretics, crypto IDs in the description. So if you want to give some specifically to heretic, then you'll be able to do that soon as well.
Yeah, speaking of which, I should also mention that I've got a video coming out very soon about why the Imperium... I always slur on saying that word. Why the Imperium of Man from Warhammer 40k is doomed to fail economically. It's a 36-minute video, and honestly, I think it came out pretty good. It's not the video's not finished yet, but just keep a lookout for that. It should come out tomorrow. That would be the 24th.
And I finished up writing an essay as well. I haven't begun editing it yet. It's not going to be very complex. It's going to be done basically in the style of Shane's Libertarian Property Rights from First Principles. It is an explanation of the alliance of the libertarian left. So basically, the Aristotelian approach to explaining libertarianism. And I think that's needed because there's a lot of confusion about that particular subject, and it's kind of hard to get into because all the resources that are available are aimed towards people who are already well versed in the nuances of philosophical libertarianism. So this should help clear some things up. and help people even develop their own views on the subject. Expand upon them. I mean.
All right. So I was just talking before about how the Federal Reserve and just central banking in general does create an incentive for people to toe the line, as it were, and it's a pretty reasonable explanation as to how it is that, or how specifically that the government incentivizes politicians who are even remotely government skeptical and run on government skeptic platforms can so quickly enter government office and not only just forget their promises that they made to curtail the power and growth of the state, but also to basically just go on to do everything that they said that they wouldn't so damn quickly. They're fundamentally incentivized to have a. I know they're fundamentally incentivized to have a rivalrous and even antagonistic view with the people they rule over, but I think it's a pretty decent explanation as to why they do.
Yeah, this is actually, I've been talking about this for a very long time, and it was actually this realization about the nature of central banking that states are inherently creatures of debt, and how they are inherently going to create central banks or something like that. Somewhat controversially, I would argue that central banking and reserve banking are functionally the same thing, because the problem is they are organizations which attempt to prescribe interest rates, whereas interest rates they're supposed to be determined by the people actually making investments. If you prescribe interest rates, then you're going to end up causing people to misallocate resources, and that is what both of those models do. But anyway, realizing that the state has to set up one of these mechanisms and is inherently incentivized to do so is kind of what introduced me to the concept of libertarianism in having a class analysis of political authority. That political authority, it specifically is a social class of people that have a defined set of interests, and that's kind of what led understanding just how profound his work actually was for libertarianism.
All right, and shall we continue?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Attitude that philosophers talk about the most, but despite what people may say, it seems that many base their actions on other propositional attitudes, like hope, fear, or desire. Similarly,
I just want to comment on something because I've just been finding this very strange. The aviator glasses or the word Biden shaped like aviator glasses. When did that become associated with? When did that become associated with Joe Biden?
I honestly have no idea. I mean, in the last frame, he had some animal I wasn't able to make out, shaped like Trump.
Oh, yeah, that's his hair.
Oh, I thought that was I legit thought that was like a turtle or something. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, with Trump, it actually makes sense because the hair, Trump's hair is pretty iconic, and people can recognize it pretty quickly. However, I don't understand the aviators at all. Like that's more of a cop thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know any perspective from which Joe Biden is particularly well known for wearing aviators.
I don't
I think his Twitter account icon has him wearing aviators with a mask, but not something he's famous for.
Yeah, I kind of just imagine that he found this picture he thought it looked good, and just there's no real other thing that I can think of that would make Joe Biden iconic, or that would be iconic to Joe Biden, unless you're able to spell out the word dementia using the word Biden over and over again, which would actually be kind of hilarious.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. All right, let's continue. I guess
I did backtrack a bit because just to show the picture that you were talking about. Anyways,
hope, fear, or desire. Similarly, a skeptic may vote based on their other propositional attitudes. While a skeptic doesn't believe anything, that doesn't mean that they don't hope for things, desire things, fear that things may happen, wonder that something might be true.
Those entail beliefs. Or in order to feel any of those things or to express any of those things, there necessarily entails a belief. So yes, it does mean that.
Naturally, if you have to hope for something, then naturally you're going to have to believe that something is going to result in something else that is going to result in improvement in your lot or life, or some improvement in some way to you. That's what that entails. So it goes without saying that a real skeptic, not a no true skeptic, would recognize that hope and fear and wonder are all transient emotional things that don't actually amount to anything. And as a result, a true skeptic wouldn't feel these emotions at all, wouldn't they?
Well, and this is particularly the reason I don't consider myself a skeptic, because I think one of the major points upon, like, one of the major premises upon which skeptic philosophy attempts to justify itself is just the idea, that there is no coherent basis for logic. And I would disagree fundamentally with that. That yes, we justify logic based on conceptual truth and what counts as sort of the best potential way of looking at a particular subject. That's Aristotle's model logic, which is why I consider myself an Aristotelian and not a skeptic.
Anyways, continuing.
Something. They may hope one candidate will enact policies that they desire, or fear that another one will enact policies that they hate. The skeptic can do all of this without assenting to the belief that one or another scenario will happen. In fact, even many non-skeptics might be worried about claiming that they know for certain something that will happen in the future. If you are going to the grocery store, you would be more likely say you're going to the grocery store because you desire to buy milk, not because you know that the grocery store has milk. Because
the fact that he's comparing voting to going to a grocery store kind of confirms what I've been saying about sort of the base assumption behind political mentality.
Also, I think one of my earliest videos was actually comparing democracy to a grocery store, but it was in a more critical sense, in the sense that any grocery store that operated the way a democracy would, the business model just doesn't make sense. So then why does it make sense for the entirety of society? That was the conclusion I was coming to. Here, he's just sort of like throwing out the example of a grocery store as though to say that every time you go to the grocery store, it's the same as voting, because you hope that a candidate is going to say something, much in the same way that you hope there's going to be milk at the grocery store, even though that's not something you can really control for.
But here's another question, and this is sort of a problem with the premise of the video. Why exactly do skeptics need any sort of uniform basis to determine why they should vote? If they even do. even if they even do consider voting.
Well, you see, Esso, there is an objectively correct way to vote. And if you don't believe in my objectively correct way to vote, then you are literally Hitler. I mean, that makes total sense, right? Yeah, anyways, continuing.
From a political mentality, sure. But let's go.
You get there, the grocery store might not have milk. It's not your belief that drives you to action, but your desire. Similarly, for the skeptic, in the case of an election, the skeptic doesn't know what someone will do, and arguably the non-skeptic probably doesn't know either for certain what a candidate will do in office. But they hope that a candidate will do things, and they...
No, that's actually not true. We know exactly what a politician is going to do. Not everything they're going to do, but we can say with absolute certainty that the taxation, the spending, the restriction on economic activity, the foreign wars of aggression, those will persist largely unabated. They may change in form in a certain way. You may get a marginal adjustment on tax amounts here and there. You may get different groups of brown people being targeted with bombs rather than this other group of brown people. But largely, they're all going to do the same thing. And I know this. I don't need a special crystal ball into the future to be able to figure this out. This is something we've seen over and over and over and over and over again. And it corresponds exactly with the incentives that government actors have that we've identified multiple times in the past, including on this stream. So, yeah, I know exactly what they're going to do. Maybe not everything, but the important things I know what they're going to do.
Seems like an interesting, like that just gave me an interesting idea for a sort of clickbaity video we could put out now that we're getting pretty close to Voot Day. I know what the outcome of the next election will be.
I think that would make a pretty excellent video. We'll have to talk about that after the stream.
And essentially just explain what the next president is going to do, or whoever wins the election is going to do, but don't actually mention who you think is, who you're claiming is going to be elected. And at the end, explain how both Biden or Trump or any of the other quote unquote third party candidates have the exact same interests, so it applies to all of them. Therefore, no matter who wins the election, we're right.
Even though 2020 is very good chance of being the last possible or the last presidential election in consequence in history, there's a decent chance to be made that that video would be basically future-proof, since we know with certainty that any president that ever gets elected ever is always going to do these things.
All right, let's continue, I guess.
Yes. 1 second. There we go.
Fear that another candidate might do other things. Those are the propositional attitudes that drive us to vote. In fact, many non-skeptics might be worried about claiming that they can know the future, like whether a candidate will keep their campaign promises. Now, think of it this way. A parent may have the fear that their teenager has gotten into a car accident when they're late coming home. They don't have the belief that their kid has been in an accident because they have no justification for that belief. But this fear can still rationally lead them to call their child. There is a negative perception often within some circles against fear or hope as ways to think of things, as propositional attitudes that can rationally drive us to action. But as this case demonstrates, it doesn't appear to be belief that is driving the parent to act. It's fear that's driving the parent to act. But I don't think anyone would say that that parent is acting irrationally. On the other hand, a scientist may hope that a particular hypothesis is correct. They do not believe the hypothesis, but they test it because of their hope that it is true. Many of our actions can be rationally based on non-belief-based propositional attitudes.
Oh, there it goes. What's up?
That's the exact opposite of how you're supposed to pursue scientific discovery. You're not supposed to start with the assumption that what you're trying to prove is already true and then work backwards because you want it to be true. Because that's not actually what you can find is the problem that skeptic philosophy has, where you can create these plausible explanations for how you came to this conclusion that don't actually explain the nature of the conclusion. So those explanations could be used interchangeably with pretty much any other explanation and would carry the exact same amount of explanatory power. So conclusions are supposed to be the emergent property of axioms. And because he's essentially showcasing here everything that's wrong with his approach to the scientific method and the skeptic approach in general.
I have wondered at the very beginning. I think we were discussing this before the stream started. If this is actually meant to be from the perspective of a skeptic, or just simply marketed to skeptics.
He claimed earlier that he is a skeptic, and it's supposed to be marketed towards skeptics. Well, self-proclaimed skeptics, and he is a self-proclaimed skeptic.
Considering that he's failed his own criteria for what a skeptic is, which is someone with no belief, it's kind of hard to say either way. So should we continue?
Sure.
Based propositional attitudes. The challenge with these emotional beliefs is when they rise to the level of belief. These emotional propositional attitudes, when they rise to the level of belief. So if you have someone that has a fear that something is the case and therefore assents to it and therefore comes to believe it. If you have someone that simply hopes something is true and therefore assents to it and takes that to the step of belief, that's where the problem lies. The problem is not in the emotional states that some people have of hope or fear. Rather, it's taking those to the degree of belief and saying that I fear that this is true, and so I'm going to assent to it and believe it. The problem is not the emotions. The problem is the beliefs. Desires, fears, and hopes often drive us to act when we are not sure what to believe.
Beginning to think we've refuted the video already. I'm just kind of hearing him out because I didn't watch this video prior to the stream, so I'm wondering whether or not it gets spicier. But yeah, this is just at this point we've kind of gotten to that part of our streams we eventually get to in videos like this, where we've talked about literally everything. Like, we've taken the wind out of his sails on every other argument that he's going to make. Now we're just left with like half the video.
Yeah. I mean, maybe he'll get around to coming to a conclusion that we can really go after. So I say we just keep playing it.
What? I don't know, chat. I don't know, chat. Do you guys particularly care if we continue watching the video? There's been very little chat interaction this stream, and I apologize for that, but I don't know. Nobody's really been saying anything of note, at least not that I've seen. And it's kind of we've got big subjects on the way in future streams, but this was kind of just because we didn't do a stream on Friday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no one's really saying anything at the moment.
Okay. So, I suppose we can continue.
All right, one moment.
Skeptic is never sure what to believe and lacks all beliefs. These kinds of propositional attitudes are the main drivers of action. Skeptics are opposed to dogma and faith.
No, they're not. They just substituted their dogma with that of statheism. They're primarily just opposed to Christianity. That's really all they are.
They don't even lack dogma. It's that they propose their dogma in a framework where it's not treated as dogma and where you are considered to be the irrational one for questioning it.
Mm-hmm. And the chat has actually started to chime in on the topic of if we should continue. And yeah, people are saying continue.
All right. I was hoping so.
Yeah. So yeah, this is just another example of the lack of self-awareness in the skeptic philosophy. They trying to say that they're opposed to dogma and faith. Meanwhile, this is a video about voting and trying to give a guide for how it is that people who claim to be skeptics or self-identify as skeptics, because that's a hip, cool, trendy thing to do in 2020, no less. This is how they should think and approach voting. And the question about whether or not they should vote, whether voting is actually a good or ethical thing, is not a question that is ever going to be brought up, even though the whole point of skepticism is to question everything. Except voting, I guess. Then it's perfectly fine and dandy. Just go along with it, I promise.
I mean, the favor towards the skeptic movement has kind of fallen out in the last couple years. But, it hasn't been, I guess a good way to put it is it hasn't been replaced with anything better. It's like, oh, I'm not a skeptic anymore. I used to watch Sargon of Akkad and those guys. Now I'm NRX, or now I'm a Marxist. Oh, like Jesus Christ! Now you're just a skeptic, but you don't call yourself one anymore. You pretend that your beliefs are scientific.
No, they're not. They're just trying to move away from that for one reason or another. I haven't really talked to those people, so I couldn't go into why they stopped being skeptics, or at least they claim to stop being skeptics. Although I think it's more likely that they just took those ideas to a logical conclusion, and it's something that Sargon and company are simply unwilling to do. Although it's kind of funny because have you heard about what the alt-right's up to?
No, I haven't heard a lot about them in a long time, but what's going on with them?
Well, they actually are taking their ideas to a logical conclusion and have come to actually embrace Islamism.
Okay.
You remember how in like 2016, 2017, their heyday, when they were very big and largely opposed to infiltration of Islamism into Western societies because my culture, my whiteness, and all sorts of ridiculous slogans? Well, now they've come around to say that because Islamists are the most strident and ardent believers of their own nationality, their own culture, and are most driven to impose it upon the rest of the world, that, well, if you can't beat them, join them.
Yeah, that seems like a somewhat fitting end to that story.
I mean, I actually kind of find that respectable in a certain way, because unlike others, they actually took their own ideas, philosophy, to its logical conclusion. Well, maybe not logical conclusion, but they took it to the next step. And that kind of honesty alone, I actually kind of respect in a sense.
Is this is this a group of people on 4chan, or is they're actually like a mass movement of this?
It's not a mass movement, and they're well past their heyday. But the big thought leaders in what's it called, in the alt-right movement, like what's his name? Baked Alaska, like I'm blanking on the name. You know who, the guy who got punched?
Oh, Richard Spencer.
Yes, him. Yeah,
Richard Spencer is an Islamist now.
They're all embracing Islam now.
That is fucking hilarious.
But yeah, that's That's something that's going on, and I'm seeing a lot of Allahu Akbars in the chat.
That's unironically pretty funny.
I mean,
I gotta admit.
I mean, the other day, my dad was talking about after he retires, he's gonna go to he's gonna go live on Hawaii, and in order to help give himself supplemental income as well as a way to keep busy, he's gonna open a restaurant called the Aloha Snack Bar. Yeah, sorry.
That'd be pretty. In Hawaii, or is this like a joke? And I went over my head because I've been up for like 15 hours now.
It's meant to be a joke, but it's also like reasonable.
It's an actual plan that he has, or is it a joke?
It's a joke. But okay. Yeah. Anyways, continuing.
Defined as belief without justification or evidence.
Bad jokes.
Well, even a non-skeptic cannot know what's going on inside a candidate's head. One may vote based on evidence such as whether that candidate changes their mind when presented with contradictory evidence, or whether they actively espouse dogmatic, unfounded positions such as blind religious belief.
Or voting.
I mean, isn't that another example of what I was talking about before, where we know with absolute fact what politicians are going to do, and we can say this universally, because among the examples I gave, one that I didn't give is express blind religious belief. And one of those blind religious beliefs is the belief in the religion of statism.
Join the party and pay tribute to the party, and the state will bless you.
The state will bless you with welfare and subsidies and chicken tendies and waffles and hugs and kisses and everything that's great and wonderful and perfect in this world. I promise. Anyways, continue. I'm going to.
So a skeptic can say, I don't know what you believe, but it appears to me that you make all of these statements about dogma and blind faith, and that is concerning to me. It makes me fearful that you have beliefs that are unjustified. I don't know that you have those beliefs, and I don't even think non-skeptics say that they can really know what's going on in someone else's head.
Actually, we can prove with absolute certainty that what a politician is going to do and what they believe is going to be unjust. They are seeking to achieve political power, which means they seek political dominion over the entirety of society and monopoly on arbitration. We know they're going to tax. We know they're going to commit unjust wars of foreign aggression. We know that they're going to restrict people's voluntary activity. We know that they're going to throw people in cages for victimless crimes. All of these things are completely unjust, so yeah.
Even if we were stripping this from the context of the state, I may not know word for word what someone is thinking, but you absolutely can look at organizations someone is a part of, their past actions, personality traits that they have, and you can use that in order to paint a pretty clear picture of, if you are going to, associate with them, what that person is going to end up doing. So yes, I think that's. I think that is a very disingenuous way of framing that, because it's not like, oh, you have to, like, what are you, a mind reader? No, it's just sort of a basic evaluation of interests. It's not like cold reading stuff. It's actually pretty, like, most people do this who engage in low-level basic social interactions on a daily basis.
All right. I actually was going to say something, but I forgot what I was going to say. Anyways, I'm going to continue.
But they say, I'm fearful that you do have those beliefs, and I'm fearful of what unjustified beliefs can do. As a skeptic, we don't assent to those kinds of beliefs for a reason. In a representative democracy, you often vote for people, not policies. Therefore, a skeptic may vote based on how similar a particular politician is to being a skeptic, or appears to be.
Assuming you're not, I don't know, some kind of self-loathing skeptic who does not believe that skeptics ought to be in power, or has some other other ideological reason to be skeptical of people who claim to be skeptics. I mean, we've talked about both on previous streams and among each other about how the last politicians that will run for office are going to claim to be anarchists. The people who say, vote for me and I will abolish the state for you. We have even though we are ideological anarchists, we have reasons to be extremely doubtful and to not vote for people who claim to be anarchists. Mostly because, well, we know that they're frauds. But secondly, it's just because it's just the hegemonic interests of the state unnecessarily going to manipulate them, even if they are genuine, into becoming state actors to victimize, coerce, and just do generally unethical things. We know for a fact they won't be principled anarchists either.
Entailment that sort of that the dependence that voting sort of entails mentally, in terms of investing time and resources into actually shilling for the elections that voting creates. There are several reasons to be skeptical of voting, even especially from an anti-political perspective. Mainly, though, that you can't use political means to achieve anti-political ends. Means have to, ends have to be a reflection of the means used to achieve them. Otherwise, there's no, as I was talking about earlier, there's no way to explain the ends that you come to, and therefore they will never actually be realized in reality, outside maybe of just the concept. And as a proposition, I mean.
Mm-hmm. With this in mind, let's see here, where was I going with this? That a politician can also easily lie. We have crap tons of examples of politicians who just straight up change. Multiple examples of politicians who reframe or even just straight up change their positions based on who they're talking to try to appeal that. Now, we understand framing your message in order to appeal to your audience. That's perfectly sensible. But people sometimes, or politicians sometimes change their policies outright and will strategize about what they say, how they say it, in order to appeal to certain bases. And it's going to be very difficult to trust anything that they would be able to say at all. Which is why if you want to figure out what a candidate is going to be like, honestly, the last person you should ask about what they're going to be like is the person themselves, because there's a very high likelihood that whatever you get from them is not going to be truthful. So, anyways, I'm going to keep going.
There are few politicians out there that are espoused skeptics, but there seem to be some who are closer and some that are further away. Even though a skeptic may not know how a candidate actually behaves or what they actually believe, they can try to vote for someone that acts as a skeptic acts as much as possible. Few, if any, candidates will be true skeptics.
I don't recall particularly if I asked that question a second ago, but why exactly does a skeptic care? Say that a skeptic is voting, which already you're making quite a few assumptions you're not justifying.
I believe this already qualifies. I'm sorry.
Which is not very skeptical of you. But why exactly is the quality that a true skeptic TM is looking for in their politician, for them to resemble their picture of a skeptic? Also, what is their picture of a skeptic founded upon?
I think it's founded upon themselves and their own personal understanding of what a skeptic is. as we've stated before, the idea of what a skeptic is entirely inconsistent, as it entirely contradicts itself. With this in mind, why a person who is actually a skeptic would ask the question, do I even want a skeptic in office in the first place? Why do I want a skeptic in office? And that's a question that I think a lot of them, because they're actually dogmatic, although they won't claim to be, they'll say, yes, I want skeptics in office. But if you actually take the skeptic philosophy seriously, as in the actual Greek skeptic philosophy, not this bastardized half skepticism that we see right here, you would come to the conclusion that no, there would be no reason to, because these people are liars, thieves, sociopaths, and murderers.
Well, this is basically the modern version of the Greek skeptic philosophy. It's just back then they had significantly less to work with, so their position was TLDR, nothing is actually real. So I would argue in some ways that's kind of worse. But anyway.
Yeah.
Some are closer to skepticism than others. It's important to remember the distinction between skepticism and conspiracy theories here. Both the skeptics...
For fuck's sake.
Yep, he's going into the freaking... he's going into the Operation Mockingbird crap.
Yeah, and this is exactly sort of what I was thinking might have been at the end of the video, so I'm glad that we continued playing it. Yeah, that is a peak rejection of the skeptic mentality, to just dismiss competing narratives about reality as conspiracy theories. You know, it also makes sense why a lot of skeptics do this, because as I was mentioning, there's no way within skeptic philosophy for them to deal with competing understandings of reality. So them using conspiracy theory in the way that the CIA intends people to do so, to just lazily dismiss people trying to put forward competing narratives about what they're observing. It makes sense that skeptics would do that. And for those who don't know, and I would imagine that most people watching do, the popularization of the tactic of calling your opponent a conspiracy theorist and treat that as though that dismisses their argument, it came from Operation Mockingbird, as Heretic was alluding to earlier. Specifically, in the Operation Mockingbird document, it was a strategy that the CIA came up with as a means of trying to dismiss skepticism towards the findings of the Warren Report.
It's basically related to the JFK assassination and all the shady shenanigans and the clear inconsistencies and people trying to figure out what the hell actually happened. And the CIA came up with a strategy to try to get these people largely dismissed and mocked out of popular discourse, because God forbid people actually try to figure out the truth and get around these ridiculous government narratives that are self-evidently incorrect.
Turns out that the tactic caught on, because there are a lot of dogmatists who would benefit from having a cheese tactic that they can throw out whenever they're being criticized, that basically, from a superficial perspective, negates the criticism without having to actually reply to it.
And the fact that they're even using the term conspiracy theory, as we're alluding to before, showcases that this person does not have no beliefs. As he said at the beginning of the video, he has very strong, very clear beliefs. Among them, and among the very many that we identified earlier in the stream, is the belief that certain theories and certain narratives about certain events in history that don't make a whole that whose official narrative don't make a whole lot of sense, that these alternative hypotheses are wrong. Why are they wrong? Because they're conspiracy theories, and if we just throw them the label conspiracy theory, then that absolves us of any sort of obligation we have as skeptics to critically examine the information and see if there actually is a there, or at the very least, enough information to cast doubt upon the prevailing hypothesis, if in the absence of a smoking gun, which there have been several instances of smoking guns, so don't just dismiss it out of hand.
Let's continue.
Yeah.
Theorists doubt the traditionally presented explanation of events. However, this leads the conspiracy theorists to adopt wild and less justified beliefs in order to fill this deep need that we have as humans for explanations.
Why are they less justified? Because they're not your narrative of reality.
Mm-hmm. And more often than not, the quote-unquote conspiracy theorist narrative actually has a lot more explanatory power to the evidence. Because people who do engage in quote-unquote conspiracy theories are very evidence-oriented. They're very interested in how people think, what their interests are, what their motivations are, where people were at a specific time, and they're very cautious about making sure that everything that they have lines up with everything they know. Sure, a lot of times that there is no smoking gun, no direct evidence or proof that showcases that their evidence or that their narrative events is 100% accurate, but even they will admit that. I mean, there's been a lot of so-called conspiracy theorists or theories that I personally have encountered, and I'm sure Esso has as well, that just simply don't make any sense. But there are a lot of others that, well, that make absolute and total perfect sense. For example, the Parkland shooting. We did a video on that when that happened, and that was very clearly the narrative of events that was being put forward there did not make sense with the evidence. For example, Daniel Bohr, aka Mr. Hogg. I only call him Daniel Bohr because you're not allowed to say his name on the internet. He was in 3 places at once while the shooting was happened. As one example among many as to why that narrative doesn't make sense. But then you have other conspiracy theories, so-called conspiracy theories, like the deep state, which doesn't make sense at all when you really go into examination as to what the deep state is, who the deep state is, what their motivations are, who is in the deep state, who is not in the deep state. There's a whole lot of inconsistencies and no real explanations as to what's going on, so we can just dismiss that theory out of hand. Well, not out of hand, but just simply because it doesn't line up with the motives in evidence.
Specifically, what's wrong with it is because it implies that state actors have competing interests from the state, and simultaneously that the state is interest neutral, which we know is not true.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, and considering the prominence of the deep state narrative in state media itself, there's strong reason for at least us to argue, as you know, I've been the main one of the two of us to put forward, that the deep state narrative is itself state propaganda designed to try and discredit criticism towards the state and misdirect people back towards statist conclusions. They identify problems like central banking, or they identify all these negative, or these unjustifiable things that the state does, and the sort of negative interests that they have, interests that are antagonistic towards the average person. And instead of, coming to the right conclusion that is an inherent problem to the state itself because of how the state inherently is incentivized to function, no, it's just you voted for the wrong people. You got to vote for different people.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to be examining that in another video that I'm working on, examining not the deep state, but neoliberalism, and how that's a very similar to the deep state hypothesis, but for the Marxoids rather than for conservatards. And it basically functions in the same way, but I'll get into that as I start getting closer to the writing of the video, because currently I'm still doing research. I mean, what's striking to me the most about the neoliberalism is that even people who put forward the narrative themselves in their own academic text admit that it's a meaningless term. It's kind of actually hilarious. Anyways, should we continue?
Sure.
While the skeptic simply suspends judgment given the possibility of error. Finally, skeptics may vote on the basis of self-preservation. A skeptic may not believe that walking off a cliff will kill them, because they're not sure. They might be dreaming. But they can be afraid that it will, and therefore avoid it, even in a dream. Similarly, while a skeptic may not believe that a particular candidate will be harmful for their survival or well-being, they may be afraid that they might be, and therefore vote against them, or hope that they'll be beneficial for their well-being and help them survive. And therefore,
honestly, I think that's been the main basis for how people have voted in the last several election cycles. I can't tell you how far it goes back, but I think a huge number of people haven't really been that enthusiastic about the crop of candidates that they've got, and genuinely do not believe that they operate in their interests. It's really just a question of self-preservation. That well, I mean, my candidate's not that great. I've got a lot of problems with him. But have you seen the other guy? Oh my goodness, he would just ruin me. And that's why I think a large part of what drives people to vote in the first place. They don't realize that there's really a more important thing that they can probably do.
Yeah, I just made this point actually pretty extensively throughout the stream, so I don't need to go on another tangent.
Yeah, probably not. Let's continue.
Yeah.
And therefore vote for them. This point should not be understated. In many countries, a lack of belief, particularly in religion, is outlawed and can be severely punished. A skeptic may vote for a candidate that they hope might abolish such laws, or against one that they fear would put them into place, simply out of desire for self-preservation. Given the animosity that many people, particularly religious people and governments, have towards skepticism and lack of belief, this is a serious issue, and laws that allow for the killing of people who lack belief, or the imprisonment of people that lack belief, is something that a skeptic certainly can vote on. What do you think? Is it possible to vote without beliefs?
If you no, it's not, because you would have to make a whole bunch of beliefs. You would have to hold a whole bunch of beliefs before you can even make it to the polling place.
Any reason you would have for voting would entail a whole host of beliefs about the political system, the state, and what exactly what exactly you think is going to happen by doing that. Just what he was talking about a moment ago. That would be sort of a great example, actually, to make the case against voting. If a state has laws outlawing the lack of belief in any sort of official religion, voting against that within the political system, it's just trading one god for another.
Mm-hmm. And even then, forget about voting itself. Even if you just wanted to go to the polling place just to hang out, you have to do a whole bunch of assumptions to simply get to that point, then hold a whole bunch of beliefs. You have to find the polling place, which requires you to look it up on the internet. You have to hold the belief that the internet is going to function at that particular moment. You have to hold the belief that the map is going to work, that your car is still going to be in your driveway, that the route you're taking on your map or your GPS is going to be accurate depending on the road. You have to operate on the assumption that the polling place, assume it's a elementary school, is still going to be there and wasn't just, say, hit by a giant meteor a couple minutes ago. So you're still going to have to hold a whole bunch of beliefs just to simply get there, let alone to be able to vote in the first place. I mean, I imagine one of the main hurdles a skeptic would have to get over before they're able to vote at all is to hold the belief that they can even vote at all.
Yeah, that in and of itself is a belief. The notion, not just what voting could do, but that you can. But just all I was going to say is, I guess what we'll leave with is that politics is absolute cancer, and it leads to things like this.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually seek to make significant change in society, then network with your neighbors and make income for yourself counter-economically. Voting is nothing more than a system of control for the reasons that Heretic and I have elaborated on earlier. And politics is the way that voting becomes a system of control. Mentally, I mean.
Mm-hmm. If voting actually changed anything, why wouldn't they outlaw it? And going even further, if voting actually changed anything, why would the state be promoting it?
Why do they want you to do it as badly as they do? It seems like pretty much everywhere you go, you see people shilling for the state and telling you need to vote and that voting is so important.
Voting is super duper important, and we know this because the state tells us to. The same state that we're trying to change through voting. Yeah, I can't see how that makes any sense whatsoever.
And meanwhile, counter economists, people who are proposing actual solutions, get shadow banned on pretty much every social media platform. Even within the libertarian movement, the organizations which are even remotely connected to state interest groups will shadow ban the writing of people like Konkin and Wendy McElroy, or just these people that actually promote these ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's really much more to say about that, but we teased early on in this video that we were going to reveal the candidate that we're going to be voting for in this election. Should I announce it, or do you want to?
You could go ahead.
All right. So after careful consideration, we've decided to come November 3rd, we're going to vote for nobody. As I'm sure you're
going to vote for what game we play on stream.
Pretty much, yeah. That's what we're going to be doing on November 3rd. We're just going to spend the entire day, well, not really the entire day, but for as long as from the moment the polls open to the moment the polls close, we're just going to be spending that entire day just streaming games. And we're not sure what game we're going to be streaming yet. That's something we'll probably figure out as we get closer to it. But yeah, that's basically what we'll be doing for the whole 8 hours that polls are going to be opening. We're just going to be playing games. And we hope
it'll be a pretty fun stream. That type of stream gives us a lot of opportunity to interact with the chat. So we are expecting this to be an event, ironically.
Mm-hmm. We'll see what comes of it, but anything you do, you don't have to spend the whole 8 hours with us, obviously, but it goes without saying that by not voting, you're making a decision that's far more significant and impactful than actually voting would, because I can guarantee you with absolute certainty that your inaction is not going to give credibility to lying murderers, and it will not give them a mandate to implement their legislative agenda. that is significantly more important than any vote for Trump or Biden.
It's time and resources that the state doesn't have leveraged over you, and it's less time and resources if you're actually out engaging in counter economic activity to make your ends meet, because you've subverted the legal economy's influence over your life or the state's ability to appropriate your resources. That is fewer bombs that the state has to put in their drones. That's fewer cops that can be patrolling the street because the state doesn't have the budget to actually hire cops. You are making a tangible change by literally not doing anything in that regard. All a cough in the background, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, he is not. He's been doing that the entire stream, and I am genuinely worried about him.
He's actually a lot better than he was a few days ago.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that only because times I've talked to Douglas, and I would hear him constantly. Whereas now, like, if there's actually pauses.
All right. Well, should we end the stream then?
Yeah, I think so. So not really much else to talk about. The video's over, and yeah, the voting is going to become significantly more important as we start to get closer to November 3rd. So this is undoubtedly not the last time we will be going on about this topic, but it's just going to be it's probably going to be a prelude to things to come. But I have very good reason to believe that come 2020 or the 2020 presidential election will more likely than not be the last presidential election of any consequence in American history. I don't know. Do you have anything more to add to that?
I'm sorry, someone was talking to me. What are you saying?
I just said that I think 2020 will be the last presidential election of any consequence in American history.
Oh yeah, for sure. I could like most major cities are in the later parts of second stage agorism. I think for sure that for 4 years, society is going to change significantly.
Oh yeah, and honestly, the time to get your supplies together, gold or precious metals, your cryptocurrency was yesterday, but it's still not too late to start. So yeah, do that. Also, make sure to network with people as best you can, because those kinds of connections that you're going to make are easily going to be the difference between life and death. So with that in mind, yeah, let's go wrap this up. Thank you for stopping by, and we're going to do a quickie stream on Friday. Does that sound good?
Yep, that sounds fine. Because I've been going around looking for people to debate on debate subjects with. So I think the next couple streams, or at least, some of the upcoming streams are going to be debate streams.
All right.
So you can look forward to those.
All right. Anyways, thank you for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.